I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Reaching Students with 7 Different Styles in One Online Classroom. The offering today was originally presented at the Walden 2019 National Faculty Meeting this past summer. Dr. Diane Duzic was our presenter, and we have the pleasure of having her back here today to present her information to you. Before we get started, I do want to go over some housekeeping items here in Zoom. As you can see, the main content will be presented on the screen that hopefully you're looking at. There are audio settings in the lower left-hand corner if you need to adjust any of those throughout the next 45 minutes. There is also a chat function, so if you have a question, please don't hesitate to ask Dr. Duzic. We will be monitoring the chat if you have any comments as well. I do recommend selecting all panelists and attendees, or everyone is another option, so that everyone can glean the insight from your comments and or questions. There is a view options at the upper part of your screen. If you need to toggle back and forth or adjust your zoom ratio to fit to window, please note that that option is there for you. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Diane Duzic. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I apologize for my bad voice, but I'm first of all getting over a cold, but I also have a voice disability, which I'll explain in a minute. Now, what I wanted to do is tell you a little bit about myself. Teaching was never a goal of mine. When I was in college, I fell in love with television production, and I began my career really after several smaller jobs as a producer for CNN from 1981 until 1989. Now, the best part of my job was training the new employees and the college interns. I enjoyed what I was doing, but I enjoyed the training part a lot more than I enjoyed producing news. In fact, if any of you remember when Tiananmen Square blew up in China, there was that big riot, I was working the night shift, and they asked my crew to stay and produce from midnight till 5 a.m. live. And everybody else on my shift was saying, yes, this is great. And I'm thinking, I really want to go home. And that's when I kind of knew that I needed to think about changing careers. Things happened in my personal life, and I applied for my first teaching job at San Bernardino Valley College and figured I'd give it a year. That turned into 29 years of teaching when I retired last year, after 29 years, and now I'm teaching at Walden. So next slide, please. Now, as I'm sure you probably know, we tend to teach the way we were taught. I grew up in the 1960s and 70s, and we were taught in factory-style schools where all you did was sit and memorize and regurgitate. College was a shock to me because all of a sudden it wasn't just memorizing and feeding back. I actually had to think and write essays and be thoughtful and write 10 and 20 page papers. And that's when I really began to learn what learning really was all about. Next slide, please. Now, as you can hear, I have a very scratchy voice. I have something called spasmodic dysphonia, and although there's no cure for it, it started affecting me in probably the early, around 2010, where my voice just got worse and worse and worse. And so I started looking for different ways to teach. Now I have a little link of a video there that I was going to play for you because I was hoping that my Botox shot I would have gotten it and been able to talk now, but the doctor put it off. So I have a link up there for teaching statistics and operationalizing variables. And as you can see by some of the comments that I've received from students over the years, and by the way, these are people who weren't even in my classes. They just happened to find the link online, and they didn't care what my voice sounded like. All they cared about was that I came up with an easier way for them to understand something that they were struggling with. Go ahead, next slide, please. So let's start talking about the different learning styles. First of all, there are oral learners. These are people who learn by listening. They don't want to write things down, they want to hear it. They absorb it from the sounds around them. And I'm going to take a break just to give my voice a little break. And I want to ask if any of you are oral learners or have struggled teaching oral learners. Anybody?
And please feel free to put your comments in the chat. It's on the lower part of the screen. And do select everyone when you enter those comments so we can all see your comments.
Actually, oral learners are probably the least common, although we do have them. And the hardest part about teaching to oral learners is they're going to freak out when you're writing all kinds of things on the board. There we go. Someone says, I'm both an oral and a visual learner. That's true for a lot of people. And most people do learn through the different learning styles. But there are people who are only oral learners. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next slide, please. Here are some ways that in our online classroom, you can reach oral learners. If you haven't used Blackboard Collaborate yet, I've started using it in my statistics class and sometimes in my 9000 and 8100 class. I've used Skype before. I do a lot of phone calls with my students, and I encourage the students to mentor one another. The most important thing about oral learners is that you use sound, although I do want to tell you that studies have shown that if you only put up audio files without supporting video, students don't learn as well, even audio or oral learners. Let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. Carolyn says, my son is an oral learner and really struggles in traditional educational settings. One thing that you can encourage your son to do, if the teacher will allow it, is to record lectures or see if you can find online videos that support what's being taught in school to help address the oral learning portion, way that your son studies. More typically is visual learners. These are people who like images, pictures, colors, maps, to organize their information and to communicate with one another. They visualize objects, plans, and outcomes in their mind's eye. Now, if you can't understand the real difference, if you're a visual learner and you can't understand or comprehend the difference between visual and oral learners, I'm going to give you an example that absolutely blew me away. The job I had before I moved to CNN was producing educational videos for Alverno College in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And my boss showed me a video that they had produced a few years before I got there. And it was on communication styles. And her instructions to me were, this video is great. Everything is perfect, except there are a few factual errors. So I need you to reproduce the video. And just fix the factual errors in the script. Those were my instructions. So I worked with a crew and we hired the same actress. We had her wear the same clothes. We had her, we built the exact same set, and we literally reproduced that video frame by frame. So it was identical. And my boss was in on all the planning from day one. And when I showed it to her when it was complete, now mind you, it took 3 to 4 months to produce this video. Her first words to me were, yeah, but it looks just like the old one. And I was shocked because she was there for the planning. And when I said that to her, her response was, yeah, but I couldn't picture it. So she's not a visual learner. Even though she heard what we were saying, she couldn't picture that the two images were going to come out identically. So understanding that people's brains really do work differently was a real eye-opener to me. Let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. Using videos means not just a talking head, and a talking head means you're sitting in front of the camera, looking at the computer and recording what you said. That's not a strong, excuse me, that's not a strong way of using visuals. Although it gives the student the eye contact, if you're going to do that, use a video phone call so that you have one-on-one eye contact. But with videos, use examples. For example, this graphic off to the right, where I have yes, P is less than 0.01 and no, P is equal to 0.000. That's part of a slide that I used in the video that was on that link earlier on teaching statistics. Seeing it and using color to enhance the yes and the no gives them additional visual clues so that they can see what works and what doesn't. I also encourage my students to use diagrams, charts, and mind maps. For example, when they're writing papers, before they actually start writing, I have them first outline what are the main topics, relate different topics to one another so you can see if one is a subset of another or if it's linked visually with two variables. For example, you have two independent variables and one dependent. Actually draw out that link so that they can visually understand the relationships among them. And of course, we have built into Blackboard Collaborate, which allows you to share your computer, allows them to see you, and you can see them. Let's go on to the next slide, please. Let's go ahead and take a look at a quick training video of Blackboard. Go ahead.
Blackboard Collaborate with the Ultra Experience is a real-time video conferencing tool that lets you add files, share applications, and use a virtual whiteboard to interact. Let's take a quick tour. You will find the session menu on the left, the Collaborate panel on the right, and audio and video controls at the bottom. First, let's take a look at the session menu. Here, you will find the information to call in on your phone, resources to learn more about using Collaborate, and the option to leave the session. If you are a moderator, you will also have the ability to start and stop session recordings from this menu. Next, let's take a look at the Collaborate panel. Open the My Settings panel to add your profile picture, complete your audio and video setup, and adjust your notification settings. If you are a moderator, you can control session settings by allowing or revoking attendee permissions. On the chat panel, you can chat with everyone in the session, or you can send a private message to another attendee. Additionally, moderators have a dedicated private channel. Next, access the Attendees panel to see who has joined the session. You can detach the Attendees panel to keep it visible at all times. From the Attendee Controls menu, you can send a private message. Additionally, moderators can promote attendees or captioner, mute the attendee, or remove the attendee from the session. From the More Options menu at the top of the list, the moderator can mute all attendees. And finally, on the Share Content panel, moderators and presenters can share a whiteboard, application, or screen and share files. Additionally, moderators can conduct a poll or start breakout groups. When you share content, it will appear in the media space. And finally, at the bottom of the screen, you can set your status, share feedback, toggle your audio and video, and raise your hand. And that's it. You're ready to jump in and start collaborating.
Okay, just a quick question. Has anybody else used Collaborate in their classroom yet?
I've been wearing fragrance my whole life.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. I found it very useful, particularly with the hard statistics classes or when I'm trying to get the students to all learn a concept and discuss it. I found it far more useful than a discussion board where half the students don't read it anyway. All right, let's go ahead and go on to the next. Yeah, classroom meetings, live classroom meetings are very, very helpful. Verbal learners use both the written and the spoken word. They find it easy to express themselves both in writing and verbally. So on the next slide, I assume a lot of you use track changes. This is an actual copy, a screenshot from a paper where I use comments and explain exactly what I'm looking for. And I use track changes so the students can see what revisions I make. And then if the student's really struggling with a paper, I'll have a phone call with them where I will actually completely rewrite a paragraph and then go through it with them on the phone so that they can see while I'm explaining what was right and what was wrong to help them get to the next level. And of course, use that writing center. Right, go ahead on to the next slide, please. Kinesthetic learners. These are the ones who need to do and touch. This is a screenshot from the video that I did earlier. Remember I said you don't want to have a talking head. That's no different than just listening. While you're talking, you want to actually show them. And I encourage my students, if they're watching a video, to pause the video and do it, and then play the video a little bit more and go through it step by step so that they can see it and then actually do it. I always tell my students, you know that you've learned something when you can teach something, teach it to someone else. If you tell the students something and ask them, well, what did you learn? And they'll look at you like you've got two heads because they wrote it down, so they're thinking they learned it. Well, no, you haven't learned it, because you have to understand it and you have to be able to explain it. And unless you do those steps, you're not going to get it. So using sound for oral learners, using visuals for the visual learner, and excuse me, doing and touching for the kinesthetic learners. Next slide, please. Ways to help your kinesthetic learners in the classroom are by using step-by-step handouts. I have folders and folders and folders of handouts that I use in my classroom, and I don't give them 20-page documents. Instead, I'll break it down to a one-page diagram or a one-page list, or at most 2 or 3 pages, and then I'll ask them to discuss it in the discussion board, particularly my 8,100 and 9,000 students. Kinesthetic learners follow tutorials very well, using live discussions and demonstrations. Now, we can't do that in person unless you're at a residency, for example, but you can do it by using FaceTime or Blackboard Collaborate, Skype, or some other tool. Have you found that, I'm sorry, could you put that question back up again? I think the question was, are mind maps?
It may have disappeared. Yeah, I know mind maps. When I was teaching in a face-to-face community college level, mind maps I found them personally to be very useful when I'd have students create them for the kinesthetic learners, because they would create and kind of redo things in their own way with their own kind of essence. Have you found that as well?
Absolutely. Now, I tend to be more linear, so I prefer outlines to mind maps. I find mind maps very confusing, but particularly when they get to be very large. But yes, a lot of students, particularly the kinesthetic learners, when they're drawing the mind map themselves, just handing them a mind map doesn't work as well as asking them to create it.
Great, thank you.
All right, let's go on to the next slide, please. Logical learners. These are people who have to have patterns and connections. So again, the mind map works. I'm more of a logical learner, so I need to see it, as I said before, in a list or an outline where I see it linearly. I like flow charts better than mind maps. But the logical learner has to have those connections and patterns. And if they don't see those connections and patterns, they're going to struggle a lot more until they make the connections themselves. When I took my first statistics class in my doctoral program, it was the first statistics class I ever had. I had, I think, through Algebra 2 in high school and college, but I'd never had a stats class, and I was a wreck. It was an 8-week class where we met Friday night and all day Saturday every other week for 8 weeks. And half the class, I was just freaking out. I understood nothing. And I literally bought 5 statistics books, and I would read the same concept in each of the different books, trying to get different angles. And I would sit and I literally created a dictionary for myself where I typed it all out, and I put links in it where if I had a term in one definition, then I would add that term in the dictionary and link it to the other. And all of a sudden, I think on the 3rd or 4th week, when the instructor asked someone to explain what a t-test was, all of a sudden, it just clicked. It was like a switch went off in my head. And she asked me to go up to the board. And I remember my friend starting to hand me my book so I could copy out of the book. And I said, I don't need it. And I went up and I started diagramming and writing equations. And all of a sudden, it made sense. And it was because all of a sudden, I understood that if you could measure the variable and determine how you were measuring your independent variable and your dependent variable and what the relationships or group differences were, all of a sudden it made perfect sense. But it took me almost half the class before I could see that pattern and the connection. So using whatever you can to connect those patterns and getting the students to talk it through helps. Let's go on to the next slide. Logical learners like mind maps, graphics, step-by-step instructions, and encouraging them to take detailed notes. Anything that allows them to grab the logic of what it is you're trying to get across. And sometimes, particularly, when you get to a doctoral program, the logic isn't always so visible. And you have to work at it. It's like critical thinking and problem solving. When you have this problem, you have to start to think outside the box. And logical learners are the ones who are best at doing that. Next slide. MindMeister is a mind mapping tool in Microsoft Teams. Now, I haven't used that, but I would like to know if anyone else has used it to see how effective it is, because I'm not familiar with it. Someone had recommended that I recommend it to this group. So if you have used it, please share and let me know how you use it and whether or not it's been effective. I know that mind mapping can work for the visual and the kinesthetic learner, but I haven't used any tools other than in NVivo that creates great mind maps for themes. So if you haven't used that, or your students haven't used it, I strongly recommend NVivo for your for qualitative studies.
And once again, you can type in the chat if you've used it, or you can unmute yourself as well. It's about 20 of us on the line. Just make sure that you re-mute if you unmute to avoid background noise.
Well, that's okay. Let's go on. People can add to the discussion at the end if need be. Next are social learners. And social learners struggle in an online classroom because they want that face-to-face connection. So what you want to do is encourage the social learner to use all the tools they can to connect with their classmates. Now, they get a chance to do that at the residencies. They connect in the class cafe and in the discussion boards. But for example, in my stats class, I've told my students, please don't anymore, when you're responding to someone else's post, don't start it with great post. I was seeing that from every single student. Great post. Boy, that was a wonderful post. Thank you for sharing. No. What I want you to do instead is say, let's take a look at what the person's post was, pull out an important element from it, and then elaborate on it or ask a question about it. Start with the facts and then have an actual discussion with the person so that it makes a connection between the two. I found that my students in my 9,000 class have really created a tight bond, and it's wonderful to see as the students move through the program how the older students start to grow and then lead the ones behind them. And then as each one graduates, they all celebrate it together online. Creating that tight connection among the students really helps. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. Social learners work in groups. They like that personal connection with the instructor. Now, I have had some students who really don't want to talk to me on the phone. All they want to do is email or through the Ask the Instructor, and that's okay, as long as we connect personally. A lot of them like the phone calls because they can immediately respond. And if you have a student who just doesn't want to chat, or I know particularly on times when my voice is very bad, I'll do a live chat with them either via text or in the classroom. And then, you know, of course, using social media is also helpful. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Solitary learners. I've had a few of those over the years, but they're also few and far between. These are the ones who are private, introspective, and independent. They don't need a lot of guidance. They just tell me what to do and I'll do it. They're the ones who are very independent and only want guidance when they're confused. Next slide, please. Solitary learners work best with email, discussion boards, handouts, and tutorials. They don't connect well with the one-on-one, particularly with a phone, or my solitary learners almost never participate in the live video discussions. They'd much rather do it on their own. Next. Okay, now that I've told you about these different learning styles, I'm going to tell you that the research has shown that there is absolutely no evidence to support the fact that you should teach to different people with different learning styles different ways. So why did I go through all of these different learning styles? And the answer to that, the answer that I've found is that you really need to use all different ways of reaching students in the classroom, because you never know what is going to connect with an individual student. When I started having difficulties with my voice, and sometimes I would have to teach for 3 hours straight, and sometimes it would be right after my shot where I wasn't allowed to talk for 24 or 48 hours. And as you can imagine, it's not easy to teach a 3-hour lecture when you can't talk. But I found that by being creative in my learning, in my teaching style, actually got the students more involved, and it improved their learning. For example, in the classroom, what I used to do on the days that I couldn't talk is I would type out entire paragraphs, or I would find a website or some text that I wanted the students to discuss. And I would point to a student and ask them to read anywhere from a sentence to a paragraph. And then I would ask somebody to put it in plain English. And if they couldn't, I would ask them to discuss it. I would ask by typing it up on the screen or writing it out on the board, and they got the hang of that very quickly, and it really got the students involved. So trying new things. Don't teach always the way you've taught before. Sometimes it gets old and stale, and you're so tired of doing the same thing over and over again, the students can sense that you've lost your enthusiasm for it. But if you create new teaching tools, if you reach out to your students in different ways, if you think about how can I reach the oral learner or the kinesthetic learner or the solitary learner, you'll also reach the other students in the class. And they appreciate being creative in the classroom. It makes it interesting for them other than just the discussions. In my statistics class this week, it's we're in week 2 of the new term, and a student didn't get a great grade on his discussions from week 1. And his comment to me was, well, I posted twice, and in all the other classes, we just had to do a minimum of 2. And then my response to him was, I'm not looking for a minimum. I'm looking for a scholarly discussion that meets the rubric and engages other students. So we need to find ways of getting the students to go beyond their comfort zone and try different learning styles other than just putting in the time to get the grade. Next slide. So my conclusion is, whether you believe in different learning styles or not, students and teachers are individuals. Teaching one way isn't one size fits all. It doesn't work for the students, and it doesn't work for the teachers either. I don't want to get stale in my teaching. I'm always looking for new elements. If I have a student who writes a really interesting post or shares some information that hadn't come up in other classes, I actually copy that and paste it into notes so I can use it in another class, so that I'm not always posting the same thing each time. Using different techniques and different tools helps you improve your teaching, and it gets your students more involved. Don't forget about the one who's just not getting it. There may be a way to reach that one that you haven't tried yet. And that concludes my general presentation. I've got a little bit more information on the next slide, and then we can open it up for questions. Just make sure that you're growing as a teacher. It takes some extra time up front, but if you develop the tools and the notes and the materials, in the long run, it saves you times, and it helps you reach students with different learning styles as you develop those different tools. Add a little something every time you teach. So, any questions or comments? Excuse me. Everybody's gone suddenly quiet. I hope I didn't go too fast.
This is great information, Dr. Dusek, and we have several on the line, and we will be sharing the slides, Heather. We'll definitely be sending those out in a follow-up email along with a link to the recording, so you will have those. You're welcome.
And we are going to do a better recording, I think, in January.
Correct.
When my voice will be hopefully on the upswing, and I won't be so difficult to listen to.
Oh, it's been a pleasure listening. You have some really great information and some great information on your slides as well. And I think it's really important for people to consider their learners as well as their own learning style. The link to the YouTube video will be in the slide deck, so all you'll have to do is right-click on the slide deck when you get it on that particular slide, and it will open up.
Oh, yes, Carolyn, I absolutely agree with you. You don't want to share too many resources in a class. I never share more than one thing at a time. If I have a lot of things in a given week, I will post them on different days. And I also, as I said earlier, I try to keep my handouts to one page if possible, because if there are so many resources, you don't know what's there to use. And I look at the discussions and I wait for the students to either ask a question or give some information that I think they don't really understand. For example, in the statistics class, a student will take a really important sounding sentence from another source, and it sounds really good, but I just know they don't have a clue what it means. So I will take that and I'll ask the students, can someone put this in plain English for me? What does it mean? If you were explaining it to a friend who's not in this class, what would you say to them? And I find when I do that, number one, it becomes clear what their misunderstandings and misconceptions are. And it also helps them clarify. So I give examples in plain English rather than in a language that only a PhD can understand. No, I agree with you. That's about the stuff that's built into the classroom. That's why I try to keep my resources very minimal unless I see a student who needs something in particular, and then I'll send it just to that student. But you're absolutely right. You don't want to overwhelm them. But that, I'm telling you, that put it in plain English makes a whole lot of sense, because it'll tell you immediately who doesn't understand what. Are there any other questions? I'm happy to share any information. Well, I'm glad, Suzanne. And I'm happy if any of you would like to contact me separately. My email is here. Feel free if you have any questions, or if you have some resources you'd like to share, please let me know. And thank you, everybody, for attending.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Dusek.
You're very welcome.
It's been a pleasure, and I really enjoyed the information. I can tell those on the line did as well. We appreciate you all carving out time. Dr. Dusek, you especially. This is your second presentation on this, and you have a recording session in January. So thank you for this, and thank you in advance. And for those on the line, if you could just take a moment, as you all know, we have another National Faculty Meeting gearing up in January of 2020. We're almost to 2020. So your feedback is so important to us, so we can get some ideas on maybe future presentations. So Dr. Dusek, if she's working on another proposal, can glean some insight from your insights. So thank you so much, everyone. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.